Hello, my friends. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 22 today. We're going to be talking about the Puritan Revolution. This is part 2 of that discussion about the Puritans. So if you haven't listened to part 21, the one from last week, then you should go back and do that so that you're ready to listen to this one, because this definitely is a continuation of that one. So we're going to continue on with the Puritans, and we are going to finish out the discussion about the Puritans today. We won't go to a third week on it, but that means that we do have a lot of material to get to, so let's jump into it. If you'll remember, at the end of the discussion last week, the king had died, and now his son has taken the throne, and that's Charles I. Charles I followed the lead of his father in desiring a centralized and powerful monarchy. So he's going to continue this push of trying to gain power for the state, for the monarchy, and to centralize that as much as possible, which meant that he was going to have to deal with some people in the religious realm throughout England. For this reason, he also clashed with Parliament, and this was another thing that his father had a real hard time with. Parliament did not get along with these kings at all, and the kings found that trying to deal with them created problems that they weren't willing to deal with. So the Puritans were not really excited about Charles I. The thing that they were most unsettled about was the threat that they always had looming in the back of their mind, that Catholicism was going to come back into play in the kingdom and kick Protestantism out. So they see this king come in. They're already concerned about the family in general of having a Catholic bent. They're even more concerned because Charles I marries the daughter of King Louis XIII of France, and that's definitely going to be a Catholic influence. In fact, when the marriage agreement was settled upon, there were concessions made to English Catholics in order to make this happen. The new queen and her court were also allowed to continue as practicing Catholics. So you've got, in the monarchy, you have the queen and her court who are practicing Catholics. That is very upsetting to the Puritans. They see that as about as close as you can get to the next step being the king just going ahead and deciding that we're going to throw out Protestantism and we're going to bring back Catholicism. So they were not excited about Charles I whatsoever. Charles I did have problems with Parliament, and they continued to have issues until it finally came to a head concerning the trial of Richard Montague. He was a proponent of the divine right of kings and an enemy of both Parliament and the Puritans. So that idea, we haven't really talked a lot about this in our discussion so far, but you probably are a little bit familiar with this from your own study of history. The divine right of kings, the idea that God has set the king on the throne, so they are without question to be obeyed. There's no possibility that they could even be wrong. God put them there, and you have to go along with what they say 100%. Well, that's not going to jive very well with the Puritans, because they've got a king that they feel like is probably really Catholic at heart and is only even dealing with Protestantism at all just long enough to get rid of it. And then Parliament that wants to have at least equal power with the king, if not honestly more power than him. So they're not going to get along with Richard Montague, and they actually put him on trial. He was brought to trial by the House of Commons after the publication of a book on this topic, which was particularly offensive to Parliament. So he put a book out there basically saying, you don't have to worry about Parliament. You don't have to listen to them. You go on with what the king says because God put him there. And they put him on trial for this. As a result of the trial, he was condemned to a fine and to be in prison. So they weren't going to kill him, but they definitely wanted him to spend some time in prison, and they wanted to fine him as well. But that wasn't going to sit well with Charles. So King Charles decides, he comes up with a plan to save Richard. And the way that he does it is he makes him his personal chaplain. Well, the personal chaplain of the king is exempt from the authority of Parliament. He's under the king now, and he doesn't have to be. It doesn't matter about the trial. It doesn't matter about what Parliament's decided. So King Charles goes around Parliament. Obviously, they're not going to like that one bit, because now here the king is even making their power less than what they think it should be, and they already didn't think it was enough. So a big problem brewing with that situation. And it leads to Charles openly having a conflict with Parliament that is not going to just be a conflict that is in the realm of the political world or debate or even the legal system. It's actually going to lead to warfare as a result of this. Parliament talked of retaliating by accusing the Duke of Buckingham of high treason. So they're saying, all right, you saved one guy by making him your chaplain, but you can't make everybody your chaplain. So we're going to go after this Duke. We'll get him, and we're going to get him on charges that are a lot worse than what we were trying to get the last one on. We're going to accuse him of high treason. So Parliament's coming after the king. They are coming hard after him. When the king heard of this, he dissolved the assembly and resolved to rule without Parliament. So one of the things the king could do, and his dad did this too, was, well, I don't like what Parliament's doing. I'll just dissolve it. And the king had the power to do that. But there was a problem with this. The king was in need of funds. Charles' dad had the exact same problem, the king before. You can get rid of Parliament, but legally, Parliament is the body that has to approve the taxes to get the funds that the king needs. It's kind of a checks and balance system. It's not 100% checks and balance, but it at least is some of the way. And it's one way that the king really practically can't rule for over a long period of time without having Parliament, because you are going to need money. And here's Charles. He's had it with Parliament. They're going after his guys. They want to put them on trial. They're trying to put one in prison and probably try to kill the other one. So he says, no more Parliament. Well, that'll solve the problem, but now he can't get the money he needs. So you can try to rule without it, but you're going to have a problem ruling without funds. This started a process of the king convening Parliament, only to dissolve it when the House of Commons insisted on dealing with their grievances before the king. So periodically, money got tight. The king would come back and think, okay, maybe we can elect some guys in the Parliament this time that I can work with. So he would try it. Never worked. The House of Commons always insisted that, hey, before we do anything to help this king out, we want to have a sit down. We want to have a face-to-face conversation with him and let him know what our grievances are. And the king didn't want to hear them. And he was after one thing, and that was money. And if it was going to be a hassle to get it, or if it was going to be probably likely he wasn't going to get it, then let's just get rid of Parliament. Don't need them. So this happened multiple times. Charles finally dissolved Parliament in 1629, resolving to rule by himself. He finally just said, that is it. It's not working. It's not doing me any good to bring them back, because they're not going to give me the money I want anyway. So I'm just not going to have them. I'll figure out a way to get by without them. And he actually did this for 11 years. So that's a long time. That's over a decade that he didn't have Parliament to enact some of the laws that he wanted, and particularly to be able to get the funds that he needed. And he had to resort to some different measures to do that. The 11 years without Parliament brought prosperity to the higher classes, but economic oppression for almost everybody else. And the reason for that is that's where Charles had to go for money. He had to go to the nobility, the aristocracy. And in order for them to agree to give him the money he needed, he had to make concessions to them. So if you keep on making concessions to the same group, that means that you have to take something away from all the other groups. And it got to the point where they were the only ones benefiting. Everybody else was doing bad. Not even just the poorest of the poor, but even the merchant class, the bourgeois, they're all hurting now. And that's one way you could get people. You might be able to get by with a lot of things, but when you start hitting people in their pocketbook, that's when they pay attention. That's when they decide the government's got to change. And that's about to happen here. In order to gain the funds he required, Charles made ever greater concessions to the aristocracy, who in turn oppressed the poor. So we talked about that. The Puritans, who attacked the excesses of the crown and of the bishops, as well as the queen, who they dubbed the new Jezebel, were rapidly gaining popular support. So the people are hurting. They're not, there's a very small segment of society that's actually benefiting from this king. Everybody else is hurting. Well, the Puritans are very vocal. They do not like Charles. They do not like this queen. They don't like the bishops being in charge, because the bishops are the members of Parliament and in the church in general who are supporters of the king. and they're against all of them. I mean, they called this queen the new Jezebel. They didn't like her. I mean, they didn't like her at all. That's about as insulting as a Puritan gets. So as a result of this, they're going to gain a lot of support in the country because people are paying attention and thinking, okay, this king is wiping us out. He has got his hands so deep in our pockets, we don't have anything left for him to get. And I need somebody on my side. Who is that going to be? Oh, wait, the Puritans. They're the ones who are the strongest against him. Well, we're going to back them then. So here are the Puritans. They're gaining support, and Charles is losing it throughout the country. So the next person to come on the scene is William Laud. In 1633, William Laud was made Archbishop of Canterbury. He loved the beauty and stateliness of Anglican worship and believed in the need for religious uniformity for the good of the state. Two things that are going to put him directly at odds with the Puritans and with Parliament. They don't want either one of these things. And there's some members of Parliament that may be okay with the Anglican worship, and there's some that don't mind there being a one church state, but they're not going to go along with the way that this guy wants to do them. So, and the Puritans certainly are not going to like this. So William Laud's he's in a position of high power, and it's just going to make things worse because that gives them one more target they're not going to like. His measures against the Puritans were both harsh and cruel, including death warrants and order of mutilation. So he wasn't crazy about them either. If they didn't like him just because of his stances, then they certainly are not going to like him now. He goes after them directly. He looks at them as enemies of what he wants to accomplish, and they were. But how do you react to that? We talked about this time and time again. You look at this past, and it's easy to see why Europe turned away from Christianity and why even to this day, largely the churches that were built there, those beautiful churches, remain mostly empty of worshipers. If they're filled, it's usually by tourists just going to look at the buildings or people that are curious about the artwork or whatever. They're not there with people truly worshiping. And there's some. I'm not saying there's not any. But it was harmed directly because of the way people that were supposedly Christians did things and treated each other. Times change over the years, and things are different. We don't look at things the way that they used to be, and thankfully we've gotten better about some of this stuff. But in spite of that, it's still hard to excuse it, and I don't think that you can just say, well, our culture was a little tougher, and that be an excuse to go out and mutilate somebody. So, where does that put them? I don't know. It's just sad. It's sad to see how badly the church and Christians got away from what the true teaching of Jesus Christ is and got into these kind of things. But it really had a lot to do with the political part and the power plays that were part of so much of this. And thank the good Lord that we're out of that now for the most part, not everywhere, but at least in a lot of ways we are. So I'm thankful for that. Charles next gave Laud full powers in Scotland. So remember the family here of Charles, they were king not just in England, but also Scotland. It was actually Scotland first. So now he's turned Charles loose on Scotland. Well, if there's one place that's going to hate William Laud more than England, it's Scotland. When Laud tried to impose the Anglican liturgy on the Presbyterian Church, remember in Scotland is big time Presbyterian, and they're not about this Anglican worship. They broke out into riots, and it soon grew into an outright open rebellion as a result of this. They were not going to go along with it. When the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland tried to limit the power of the bishops, the king's agents declared it dissolved. So they kind of tried to treat this group like they treated Parliament. They just said, well, you're not going to go along with what we want, you just don't exist anymore. Well, that didn't exactly work. But the assembly refused to obey the command and responded by abolishing the episcopacy and reorganizing the Church of Scotland on a Presbyterian basis. This made war inevitable. They didn't go along with Parliament and just say, okay, well, the king said we are out of session, so we're out of session. They said, no, we ain't out of session. We're going to keep on going. As a matter of fact, we're going to kick out all of these people that you're trying to bring in to govern us. We're going with the Presbyterian way, and that's going to lead to outright open defiance, which is going to lead to outright war. The king did not have a sufficiently large army nor the funds to keep one on the field. So king wants to go to war, but he doesn't have an army big enough to really go to war with Scotland. And he doesn't have money because he's dissolved Parliament. He doesn't have money to recruit that army and be able to actually put them out on the field and be able to support what they're going to need to go out on the field. So he decides, I'm going to have to look outside of England to get some help. So he looked at the Irish, and the reason was because they were strong Catholics and they would automatically be against Scotland because they're strong Protestants. So he's looking to them for support. As a result of all this, Scottish Calvinists and English Puritans grew closer together. They were the common friends because they had the common enemy, and it drew them together as the king's trying to break all of these groups apart. In 1640, Charles called a meeting of Parliament in hopes that he could gather funds for his war against the Scottish rebels. Why he thought that was going to work, I have no idea. Parliament, especially the House of Commons, is going to relate a whole lot more with the Scottish rebels than they are with Charles. But I guess he's thinking maybe, nationalism, we're all the English, let's settle our differences and come together and repel these Scottish people, and maybe I can bring them around that way. Not really. But when it became clear that there were many in the House of Commons who would not support the king, what's Charles going to do? Is he going to go to him and say, hey, let's reason this out, let's work together? No, he just dissolves them. Done again, you're out. No more Parliament, don't need you. And so this became known as the Short Parliament. They didn't meet long at all. They didn't do anything either, and most of these groups really didn't do anything for a while, but this one in particular didn't. So once again, Charles' efforts to raise money to support what he wants to do is foiled, and Parliament has to go away, in his opinion. The Scots invaded English territory, prompting Charles to convene Parliament once again. So now the enemy's at the gate, and it actually has come over into England. England's used to going all the time into Scotland, not the other way around. Now Scotland's come in on their territory, and the king's like, whoa, we got to stop this. I may not be getting along with Parliament, but I'm sure not going to get along with these Scottish invaders if they make it to me. So he tries to bring Parliament along one more time. This began the Long Parliament, which would be of great importance to the history of England. So this Parliament comes together, and they're not going to be dissolved. They're going to do things just a little bit different. The king will greatly regret that he ever brought Parliament back together, although he didn't see any way of getting around it at the time. It's not going to go well for him. It's going to lead to his end, actually, and it's not going to be in the way that he would have wanted. So looking at this Long Parliament, in the years preceding the Long Parliament, social and economic upheavals began having a negative impact on the bourgeois. So remember, people in these countries in Western Europe and England and Scotland and Ireland, they were used to the poor getting dumped on, but they weren't used to the merchants getting dumped on. They weren't used to the bourgeois getting dumped on. They weren't used to that. That was something that they weren't expecting to happen, but it had happened, and it had happened for a long period of time. And this group had had enough of it. They wanted something to change, and they have a lot of influence in Parliament. You can only get away with doing this stuff for so long before the people finally say, that's it. And the time had come where they said, that's it. Therefore, the majority of those elected to the House of Commons represented those who were discontent with the king. So this group, the House of Commons, is driving the bus on this deal. The House of Lords, they've got a little bit of support there, but largely, they're not going to be a factor in this. The House of Commons are the ones, and they are the ones that are adamantly against the king because the people who had elected them were adamantly against the king. Since many of the nobility had joined with the bourgeois by investing in mercantile enterprises, many in the House of Lords joined with the Commons in limiting the king's power. So in this sense, they did have support from the House of Lords because these members of the aristocracy, although the policies that the king had put in place actually tended to benefit them more and certainly didn't directly harm them. They did harm them in the sense that they had begun to invest in the enterprises of the merchant class, the bourgeois. And now those investments are not coming home. They're going down. And so they're thinking, whoa, we got to stop this because it's hitting me in the pocketbook now. So everybody's getting hit. And that's a bad situation for a ruler. Again, you can get away with a lot of stuff, but when you start sucking people dry of money, you start taking away what they really care about the most, which is their own material goods and financial future and all that stuff. then you're going to have a group that's willing to stand up and say no more. And this is where we've come to here. The king had convened parliament for the purpose of raising funds, but this parliament proved even more intractable than the previous one. So if he thought the ones before were bad, he got the worst version of them all. And you can understand why that would be. All these years of not having a parliament just made people resent it. And the fact that the king was ruling unopposed and he was killing people, he was just sucking them dry every which way he could. All that did was embitter people for a long period of time. They were ready to cut loose on this king. This parliament was in no hurry to help the king. So that in that way, they were just like the other ones. But the situation is a little bit different now. The king he can't just dissolve them. He's got to get something done because his country's being threatened. And he can't just let that keep going on. So he can't just cut them loose right off the bat. They start out by adopting a series of measures against those who had sought to destroy Puritanism. So they're going to strike back a little bit against the ones who had tried to wipe out the Protestant movement in England. And they've got an agenda, this parliament does. And at the top of their list is not let's help the king. At the top of their list is let's get back at the people who have been coming at us. And they did it. Those Puritans who were still in prison were set free and given an indemnization payment. So they got some money for their troubles. They were unjustly put in prison. They shouldn't have been. So they did that. Lord Strafford, one of the king's loyal ministers, was brought to trial and condemned to death. And now the king's not dissolving parliament anymore. He's lost a lot of power, and he knows this, so he's not going to get involved. Probably old Stratford went in there thinking, well, the king's he'll bail me out. Well, the king didn't bail him out, and he's going to go on ahead and die. He's going to be killed. The law in Parliament's going to continue to do a lot of stuff. Then Parliament took steps to ensure that its measures would have permanent value. So they're going to make sure, we're not going to let the king dissolve us this time. We're going to put a stop to that right now. And they did. In 1641, the Parliament passed a law establishing that the Assembly could not be dissolved by the king without its own agreement. So the law said, okay, king, if you want to dissolve us, you can, but you have to get our say-so. You get a vote and we get a vote. And if it's not 2-0, then you don't dissolve us. And so that pretty much put the power out of the king's side. There's not a checks and balances system anymore. And it really wasn't before either, because anytime the parliament tried to intervene, the king just got rid of them. So now the power has swung way over to the parliament side. And the king doesn't really have any way to check them at all. Should have been a better system what they had, but in all honesty, it was better than a lot of other places. When Parliament began discussing the matter of funds to fight the Scottish rebels, it was discovered the king had been negotiating with them in hopes of undoing the power of Parliament. Now, this was a rumor, more or less. There was some evidence to support it, and later on they're going to find out that it actually was true. But it was enough. They were absolutely livid to find out that the king had been inciting these rebels to come in because he needed them in order to say we've got to have the means necessary to fight them, and that means Parliament, you have to give me what I want. So this was a way of him trying to get around Parliament and make them go his way. And they find out about it, or at least they hear rumors about it. They're not going to like that a bit. And then there's something else comes out. It was also discovered that the Queen had instigated a Catholic rebellion in Ireland, supposedly to embarrass Parliament and make them grant funds to the king. This one is not necessarily as easily proven. This one was even more of a rumor, and I'm not sure that they ever did prove it, but they weren't in any mood to need proof at this point. This sounded like something this king would do, and that was good enough for them. So they already hated the Queen and called her Jezebel, and they would have thought, well, it's just like her to go and do this. So now Parliament's ticked off. They're not going to help this king anymore. This drew the more radical Protestants into a closer alliance with those whose goal was to limit the power of the crown. So they're all coming together now. We're all in this together. Good, bad, different religious groups, different thinking on how to govern the church, more radical, less radical, conservative, liberal, however you want to put it, are all together, and they've got one target in mind, and that's the king. This king is in big time trouble. Big time trouble. The bishops who were members of the House of Lords were Charles' main supporters in Parliament. So there was a group that was trying to support the king, and it was those bishops. And so the Parliament decided, maybe we don't need these bishops. So the House of Commons began proceedings against some of the bishops. When the accused tried to attend Parliament, the people of London rioted and barred them from entering. So here you're having a trial, putting on trial people that can't come to the trial. That's not a good thing. But the people, again, had enough. They had been treated badly. They were economically hurting big time, and they knew something needed to change. And if it meant that means you kick the bishops out, well, then the bishops get kicked out. So they stand up and determine this is what's going to happen. Emboldened, the more radical members of the House of Commons announced their plans to bring the Queen to trial. So now they're really stepping up in class. We've gone after some of the king's closest allies. One we didn't get away with, another one we did. We're going after the bishops who are his supporters and getting rid of them. Now we've got basically total power. It's time to go after this queen. We hate her guts. So do you think the king's going to sit still for that? No. These extreme measures provoked a reaction against the Puritans. Many in the House of Lords decided the time had come to restore order. So they're thinking, all right, these Puritans are out of control. They're going, what do you mean they're going to put the queen on trial? No, we can't have this. So the House of Lords decides it's time for us to step up. We're going to put a stop to these House of Commons. Didn't go quite the way they planned either. This long parliament is going to continue. There's a long parliament. There's a long amount of stuff that they did. But the king, unwilling to wait for the House of Lords to act, brought accusations against the leaders of the Commons before the House of Lords. Here's where the king made a huge mistake. He had the House of Lords on his side at this point because the other group had gone too far, and they were going to step it back. They were going to walk it back, try to get things under control, get a whole lot more manageable situation for the king. But here's a man, his wife's been threatened, and you can understand he's probably got a lot of people in his ear about, you can't let this happen. And so, and then he's going to have his own feelings as a husband and as the king. I'm not going to let this happen to my queen. So you can understand why both sides did kind of things that they did, but he should have stepped back and thought about it, because he decides then that he's going after these people in the House of Commons, and he thinks he's got everybody in the House of Lords willing to be puppets and do what he wanted, and he made a huge mistake. The Lords, fearing that the king would be given the power to one day take similar action against them, rejected the accusation. When the king ordered the arrest of the accused, Parliament refused to surrender them. So the House of Lords starts thinking, wait a minute. If the king can go in and arrest all the House of Commons leaders because he doesn't like what they're wanting to do, then what's going to stop him? If we let that happen, what's going to stop him from turning around and doing that to us later? And they got together and said, all right, boys, we're not doing this. The king's not coming in here and arresting us. He's not getting them. He's not getting us. And so they refused to turn them over to the king. When the king sent officials to arrest the members of Parliament, the people of London refused to allow them to pass. So now the people of London are stepping in again. First they step in. They don't let the bishops go to trial, so they won't let them come in. Now they're even barring the king's officials. This is how ticked off they were. They were willing to step up to the king's officials. It was basically like stepping up to him. So they've had enough. The people in London have had enough. Parliament's had enough. Everybody's had enough. Having lost his capital, he's lost the capital now. He's lost London because the people are basically barring his own representatives from walking around. He gets out of there. He decides it's time to get out of Dodge. So he retreated to his palaces, Hampton Court and Windsor. Parliament ruled in the king's place. So the king's out of the picture. He's not dead. He's not in prison, but he's basically in exile in the country. They passed a law expelling the bishops from the House of Lords. So they finally got rid of all of them. They're all out. House of Lords doesn't have as much power. They don't have as many members anymore. They don't have the bishops who are the main king's allies. The House of Commons is in charge. That's what it boils down to. When the law passed without opposition, a process began that would progressively exclude from Parliament those who opposed the Puritans. So they start going the other way with this, which is usually what happens. An oppressed group gets power, they end up oppressing back. And unfortunately, it's a human nature thing, and it's happened many times in history. So They don't just want to balance things. Now they want everything to swing their way completely. And they're going to exclude anybody who opposed these Puritans, who opposed the ones that were kind of running the show in the House of Commons. Next, Parliament gathered an army. So this is taking it a way step farther. This isn't a political game anymore. This is actually going to get down to blood. When the king heard of this, what's he going to do? Well, he's going to get his army too, because they're not gathering an army just to have them around. They're gathering an army to oppose the king. So he goes and gets his troops. He finds the ones that are loyal to him, and he starts putting together a militia to oppose Parliament's militia. The conflicts between the throne and Parliament had finally led to civil war, so it's coming. And this war, the Parliament doesn't really have great cavalry forces. The king does have that part. Parliament has better naval forces and infantry, so they're going to be fighting a little bit differently. The king is going to have the upper hand when it comes to the cavalry. The Parliament's going to have the upper hand, particularly in the naval type battles. So they're each going to have an area that they're strong in, but there's not one group that's going to be able to take over the other one initially. And so we come to war, civil war. Both sides began building up their forces. Charles found supporters among the nobility, while Parliament found it among those who had suffered in recent times. So obviously, the king's going to have the aristocracy on his side of the nobility, and Parliament's going to have everybody else. Charles also found outside support from the Irish, while Parliament found help from the Scots. So they are looking for their outside group, and they kind of settle on the same two that they've been going with. In their efforts to attract the Scots, Parliament took a series of measures that leaned toward Presbyterianism. So Parliament's going to say, hey, Scots, you like the Presbyterian church? Well, guess what? We do too. We're going to bring them in. We're going to start doing things the Presbyterian way. Don't you want to come and help us? So kind of dangling a little carrot out there to try to get them to come along. Parliament also convoked a body of theologians to advise it on religious matters. This group, known as the Westminster Assembly, included 121 ministers, 30 laymen, and 8 representatives from Scotland. And because of how much they needed the Scots, those 8 representatives from Scotland ended up having a whole lot more power than the rest of the group combined. Although every member did not agree, the Assembly opted for the Presbyterian form of government, obviously, because that's what the Scots wanted, and recommended that Parliament adopt it for the Church of England. In 1644, Parliament enacted the Solemn League and Covenant, which committed them to Presbyterianism. So they have gone a long way to get the Scots to support them, but they need them, so they do it. The following year, William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was executed by order of Parliament. So this dude who came in, he had attacked the Puritans, he had killed some of them, he had mutilated them, he had put them in prison. They hadn't forgotten about that, and it was time for them to go ahead, oh, wait a minute, we got to clean up a little mess from the past. And they go out after William Laud, and they get him, and they kill him. So they strike back and get their revenge for what he had done. Now, this brings us to a person I'm sure that you've heard of before, if you've studied any kind of history at all of this time period, and that's Oliver Cromwell. It was at this time that Oliver Cromwell came to the forefront. He was a relatively wealthy man who had become a Puritan a few years earlier. So here was this guy. He was a member of the House of Commons. He wasn't any kind of big shot in that group. I mean, he was one member of many, and he was definitely respected. He was a Puritan and had come to Puritanism, even though he had come from kind of a life of wealth. But he wasn't in any way superb yet. But he's going to make his mark coming up soon. He was convinced that every decision, both personal and political, ought to be based on the will of God. And that would have been going right along with those Puritan ideals that he held. This meant that once he came to a decision, he followed it through to its final conclusions. One thing about Cromwell is he didn't tend to make decisions quickly, because he did take time to consider what he felt like God was telling him. But once that decision was made, it had the force of being the will of God. He believed he had the will of God. And so when you believe you got the will of God, you're not going to change courses. And that's the kind of guy he was. Once he made a decision, it took a while. People would get impatient. But once he came to it, it wasn't any going back. It was it. That was the one thing they were going to do, and they were going to follow it to its logical conclusion. That's the kind of fellow he was. Cromwell was thought of as just one more member of the House of Commons, That's how he was initially, but what changed? When war seemed inevitable, he returned home and recruited a small corps of cavalry. So he knows that the weakness of Parliament's army is they don't have a great cavalry. So he goes and gets him some and brings them with him. His small cadre became a mighty cavalry who charged into battle singing psalms. So these guys, they were absolutely convinced, as Cromwell was, that they were doing the will of God. And so they went into battle strong, hard, they fought hard, and they inspired the rest of the army that the Parliament had. Soon the entire army of Parliament, convinced it was waging a holy war, crushed the king's army at the Battle of Naseby. The battle was the beginning of the end for King Charles. The rebels captured his camp and found proof that the king had encouraged foreign Catholic troops to invade England. So now here's the proof they were looking for. The king had actually gotten the Catholic troops to invade. He had encouraged this. An outside foreign enemy invading his own country under encouragement of that country's king is not going to go over well. And that was the end for him. He's done. He doesn't know it yet, but he's done. The king was captured by the Scots, who turned him over to Parliament. Having won the war, Parliament adopted a series of Puritan measures, including ordering that the Lord's Day be reserved for religious observances and forbidding frivolous pastimes. Well, what are the frivolous pastimes? We'll get to that in a little bit. But here we go. The king's captured. Parliament has him, and they are running and ruling on high. And things can't get any better for him, right? Well, what does that mean? If it can't get any better, then it only has one way to go, and that's down. And that starts to happen because they can't get along. There starts to be internal feuds. All of this, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, what happens when you defeat the enemy? Well, now all of a sudden you got two groups that didn't like each other that much to start with. And this is what's going to happen here. But the Puritans became divided among themselves. The majority of Parliament by then supported the Presbyterian form of government. Well, they had to go along with it because of the Scots, and they've said, well, let's go with this. But there was an independent group, and these independents, who made up the majority of the army, felt that a national church with a Presbyterian form of government would deprive them of their freedom to obey the Bible as they understood it. So Parliament wants to go with this. We're only going to have one church. It's going to be governed in the Presbyterian form, and everybody has to abide by it. Well, the army, this other group that was the one who had fought the war, said, well, no, wait a minute. We're independents. We want to be able to figure it out for ourselves. Every church has autonomy. They can go along and do it the way they want to, and we're not under a national church. And so these two ideas are not going to mesh. They are oppositional, and it's definitely going to lead to a clash. In 1646, Parliament tried without success to dissolve the army. So they tried the old king's tactic. Well, we'll just get rid of you. We don't need an army anymore. Poof, you're gone. Well, that doesn't work too well with armies. They've got arms and they're used to fighting. So just telling them you're dissolved doesn't work. Parliament and the army continued to clash over who should speak for the nation. The army decided we're the ones who kind of fought this war, so we'll be the ones to speak for the nation. Parliament said, we're in charge of that, so they're going to clash. Then the king escaped. Well, while all this is going on, they don't have time to take care of the king. He gets out of there. And he says, I'm going to go along with the first group that's going to help me. So he opened negotiations simultaneously with the army, Parliament, and the Scots. And whichever one would come to his defense, that's who he was going with. Well, he got the Scots, he gained their support first. So he told them, if you will help me out, I will establish Presbyterianism as the law of the land in Scotland, but also in England too. And they thought that was a pretty good deal. So now the king's all right? He's got the Scots on his side. He's going to be fine. No, he's not. The Puritan army defeated the Scots. They couldn't beat the Puritan army. They captured the king, and they began a purge of Parliament. So now the Puritans are definitely in charge. They won a second war. They defeated the king once again. The Scots are no longer in play, and they can go ahead and start kicking people out of Parliament. 45 leaders of Parliament were arrested, and many more were prevented from attending sessions. Others refused to attend, so they are running roughshod over Parliament now. What was left of Parliament became known as the Rump Parliament, and that's because that was all that was left, the rump. This is a little rump group. They initiated proceedings against Charles. He was accused of high treason and of having involved the country in civil war. There's some merit to these accusations, what the king had done, but was it legal for Parliament to put him on trial? He disagreed with that. Without the consent of any of the 14 lords who dared to appear for the meeting of the House of Lords, the House of Commons began the trial. So the House of Lords didn't go along with it, but there's only 14 of them left anyway. They had kicked all the rest of them out. And some of them were still actually in the group. They weren't going to show up for the meetings. They decided they didn't go well for their predecessors, their colleagues, so they didn't show up. But the 14 that were there, they didn't vote for the trial to continue, but it didn't matter because at that point, the House of Commons far outvoted them, and they began the trial. Charles refused to defend himself on grounds that his judges had no legal jurisdiction. He basically said, I don't have to defend myself in this trial because you don't have the right to put me on trial. The problem with that is he didn't have any army on his side. He didn't have anybody on his side, and they could do what they wanted to him. So on January 30th, 1649, Charles was beheaded. So Parliament has pretty much, or not even Parliament, the House of Commons in England is now the ruling power in the country. They have defeated everybody, and they have killed the king. So what's going to happen now? They're going to rule and reign over England, right? Wrong. That's not what's going to end up happening. The Scots rapidly acknowledged Charles II as their ruler, while the Irish seized the opportunity to rebel. So more chaos is coming. In England, the independent Puritans were splintering that group, so they're not going to be all united to rule anything. They're falling apart. Among the more radical groups, the Diggers grew strongest. So this is a radical Puritan group. This movement advocated a new social order in which the right to property would be universal. So they were trying to give everybody in society the right to own property. Pretty progressive for their day and time. Those ideas won't come along till later, but the people of the time weren't really going to go along with that too well. Meanwhile, the Presbyterians insisted on a national church, which the independents saw as tyranny. Chaos threatened the land. So there's a big need for a central figure in the government to step forward. And the person who did that was Cromwell. He took the reins of power. He first stamped out the Irish Rebellion, so he put a stop to that. Then he put a stop to the royalist outbreak in Scotland, and Charles II had to leave. He was forced to flee, and he went to Europe. Then, when Parliament began discussing a law that would perpetuate its power, Cromwell appeared at the session, expelled the few remaining representatives, and blocked the building. So Cromwell comes in. He did what the king wanted to do, but he couldn't do it anymore. And that was he dissolved Parliament. He finally got rid of the law in Parliament. It was down to just a few people that were in charge anyway. And he got them out of there, and he locked the building up. Not going to be any more Parliament. Cromwell is now in charge. Thus, against his own will, he didn't want to be the ruler, but he ended up being. Cromwell became master of the nation. He eventually took the title Lord Protector. So he's going to start the protectorate. It's not going to be royal rule. It's not going to be parliamentary rule. It's going to be one guy who's not the king, but he's the quote-unquote Lord Protector. He did establish a new parliament, but in truth, Cromwell was the real government. He had people in there that would go along with whatever he says. It didn't really matter about them. Cromwell then set out a program of reformation of both church and state. So he's going to try to change things the way he thinks they need to be. It's going to have a very big Puritan bent. But although he was an independent, Cromwell attempted to develop a religious system with room for Presbyterians, Baptists, and even more moderate advocates of episcopacy. So Cromwell was for tolerance, and he did want to have a system of government that allowed for more than just one type of belief system. So you have to give him credit for that. He also tried to reform the customs of the land through legislation regarding the Lord's Day, horse races, cockfights, the theater, and etc. More stuff like that. So these were the things that earlier when we talked about the Puritans were against some of the frivolous activities of the day. This is what they were talking about. They wanted Sundays to be, by law, reserved only for religious practice. That's something they carried over to the United States for years. When I was a child growing up, even in my teenage years, we had what we call blue laws on Sunday. You couldn't sell certain things. There were rules that tried to establish Sunday as more of a day for church. It wasn't to this extent, but they definitely still existed. And this is if you can remember those or read about them in history or whatever, though that thinking came from this time period, from the Puritans. So much of the way religious practice happened in the United States was very directly related to Puritanism when it comes to this kind of thing. So they wanted the Lord's Day of Sabbath. They did not like horse racing, didn't want it, didn't like cockfights, they didn't like the theater. We had talked about that a little bit last week too. Things like that. They looked at them as just being things that didn't need to happen. But they went a step too far. It wasn't just their own conscience. Now they're trying to make laws for everybody. And that's what Cromwell was for, and that's what he did. His economic policies favored the middle class to the detriment of both the aristocracy and the poor. So now things have swung. The group that was being hurt, that was the most vocal and that had the power to do something about it, was that bourgeois group, that middle class, the merchant class. He's going to help them now. But again, when you help one group, somebody else suffers. So now the rich, the aristocracy, and the poor are both equally going to be harmed by his policies. Cromwell ruled until his death in 1658. He was offered the crown at one point, but he refused it. He didn't want to be king. He did name his son Richard as his successor, but Richard soon resigned his post. He did not want to rule. So that's going to put a stop to, that's going to put an end to this protector idea. It couldn't keep going, and there needed to be somebody to rule in the place of Cromwell, and the guy that he picked, his own son, wasn't going to work out. So things are going to change again, and that's going to bring us to a restoration of the way things used to be. The failure of the protectorate led to the restoration of the monarchy. So you don't have a protector anymore, you got to have a king. So the king's coming back. Charles II actually was the guy that was recalled. They brought him back. He was in the line to succeed his father. So they bring him. Charles II comes into the throne. The new group restored both the episcopacy and the Book of Common Prayer and issued laws against dissidents. So this guy's going to come in and wipe out all the gains the Puritans had made, all the Presbyterian stuff, all of it gone. He's back to the Anglican worship, the episcopacy and the high church and all that stuff is back, and now it's the law of the land. So things have swung back the completely opposite way. But these laws were unable to stamp out most of the movements that had emerged during the previous period of unrest. So they didn't get rid of them, as we've seen in all these periods of time. Persecution doesn't eliminate them. It usually consolidates them, and that's what happens here. They continued to exist outside the law until late in the century toleration was decreed. So eventually it would come back to where they were legal to meet and worship, but not yet. That's going to have to get back to that. But they didn't stop just because the law said they couldn't meet. In Scotland, riots and revolts occurred when the Presbyterian Church was outlawed. So again, in Scotland, it's not going to go over, and they're going to fight back. Archbishop James Sharp was murdered, so he's on the side of the episcopacy. And this brought about intervention by the English, and the Presbyterian rebellions were drowned in blood. So England sends his army, they go in and they tear Scotland up and get them under what they think is the right kind of control. The successor to Charles II, James II, resolved to restore Roman Catholicism as the religion of his kingdom. On Charles II's deathbed, his dying breath, one of the things he did was he committed to being a Catholic. And it was like, for the Puritans, it was like, aha, we knew it all along. These guys, they actually were Catholic at heart. And they really were. That's what they had been raised with. And that's what they wanted. But James II comes along, and he finally does what the Puritans had feared. He wants to bring Roman Catholicism back as the religion of the kingdom. And he begins to make measures to do that. After 3 years under James II, the English rebelled and invited William, Prince of Orange, and his wife Mary, who was James' daughter, to occupy the throne. So they're not going to stand for it. They're not having Catholicism come back. And the people stand up and say, nope, you're out, James, you're out. We're bringing William and Mary in. And they come in to rule. William arrived in 1688 and James fled to France. So he got out of Dodge and went to France. By the following year, William and Mary were in possession of the Scottish crown as well. So the monarchy had now regained not just the English crown, but also the Scottish crown as well. And that happened under William and Mary. And that was in 1689. In England, religious tolerance was granted to anyone as long as they did not conspire against the sovereign. So they were very good on a religious tolerance. They're going to bring that into place the way that it should have been all along. And it would have avoided all this. In Scotland, Presbyterianism became the official religion of the state, which is what they wanted. And the Westminster Confession is doctrinal norm. So they get what they wanted. Things are going to settle down now. They're better than they were but they're not 100% the way everybody wanted them to be. Even after the Restoration, however, the Puritan ideal lingered on. Very influential, even to this day, and in our country as well. And two literary figures that, if nothing else, if you haven't read their works, you've definitely heard of them, I would think. Two literary figures were of particular influence. John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, and that became a very popular book of devotion and a very influential book through the years. And then John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. And that book, that writing of his, Paradise Lost, determined the way a majority of the English-speaking world read and interpreted the Bible. So these two guys, very influential in literature, literary way, and they were very heavily Puritan-based. And so Puritanism hasn't been stamped out. The ideal lingered on. They didn't get total control. They had it for a little bit. They couldn't keep it because they couldn't get along with each other. But they're going to be a factor going forward. So that's the Puritanism. That's the Puritan Revolution. We've talked a long time today. We talked a lot over 2 weeks about them. We're going to make a little transition now. As we wrap this session up, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at 3 different groups and what their orthodox positions were, starting with Catholicism. We'll look at Lutheranism and the Reform movement as well. So kind of get up to date on where they're at now. We'll look at that before we start moving forward in history. So hope that you enjoyed this today. Thanks for taking a little bit extra longer time with me to finish this session out. And God bless, and hope to have you back next week.